Yeah, the problem you're describing is exactly the problem we have, and we would really like to solve that problem. After they'd understand the problem, they'd say, great, what software solves that problem? And instead of proposing something, I would say, well, let's figure that out, right? You know, when you take the architecture picture of what the solution might look like, they could all the vendors could stick products into the boxes and say, yeah, we have this module that does that. So as part of the projects on a couple of them, I said, okay, great, we're going to configure your software to actually do what that box is supposed to do. You get the project team involved, and the project team, one of the discussions with them in the midst of their designing session was, oh, listen, the timelines for the project are so tight that we're going to take the existing general ledger feeds, we're going to feed the general ledger feeds to the new general ledger, then we'll go do that stuff later. Well, it breaks the whole architecture purpose of a single flow, right? You've got all this stuff getting aggregated into these high-level feeds that goes right to the general ledger, and then the detail shows up later in the data warehouse that has to be reconciled. It's a different booking system and all of that. So even though the software said it could be done, I couldn't get the implementation people to understand why you would do the work of doing it the way we'd outlined. My conclusion, after having done this for a while and seeing that the software vendors still didn't solve the problem is that the CFO's budget on an annual basis is tiny compared to the total problem he has to solve. He has a small number of staff relative to any one of the lines of business, but his systems that he owns, they touch every business transaction in the bank. This isn't a heart and lung transplant. This is a heart, lung, and circulatory system transplant, because effectively every business transaction gets accumulated into this thing that the CFO owns, and his budget to ever think about replacing that system, it'll never happen. It took me about 5 years to actually write this paper, which is I put on my blog. A proposed approach to minimum cost for financial systems data maintenance. This is an isoquant graph. So every leg of this is about producing the same set of reports. So if you take a body of analytical outputs, however many that is, right? And you want it to be a very large body for a financial company of some sort. And if you, in the first instance, you produce all of your analytical reports off of transactions, it can be done, right? If you have all the transactions, you can produce any analytical report you want. But the cost is very high because you're accumulating a lot of transactions to get to that. So if you want something that's a little bit less expensive, you just move one in, and now you use mostly transactions, but you use just a few balances, because balances get rid of the need for transactions. So that reduces your cost just a little bit. Well, you keep moving in on this until you come to this point where you use mostly balances, but there are some reports that balances aren't adequate to solve, and so you have to have, at times, you have to use transactions to do those kinds of reports. That's the minimum cost point, the interior minimum cost. Now, why things happen on this other side is because the number of permutations possible in financial reporting off of a set of transactions can exceed the number of transactions there are in the system. It's a function of the number of attributes in every transaction. And you can set up systems that produce balances on a daily basis that no one ever goes and looks at the balance. It doesn't solve any problem. So you can end up over here where you have systems that are maintaining balances and producing reports, and yet they're increasing the total cost of your environment because you're maintaining more balances and not reducing the total cost. So getting to this point is the key concept. And the point behind the paper is to posit that, in fact, today, that point doesn't require the same kind of general ledger we've had in the past. Because the general ledger was a set of balances you maintained that gave you an enterprise perspective. But if you change the nature of those balances to be much more granular, that you're maintaining, like we've done on the FTP system, then you're reducing the total number of balances you're maintaining in the organization. You use transactions where it makes sense, and that gets you to that minimum cost point for maintaining data. This is volumes and accesses. Volumes, access, cost, all of that is on that. Because if you go back to cost, this is cost of computing since 1964, and this is the amount of computing. Well, our systems were developed over here. I mean, the basic structure of our financial systems was developed in the 1960s, 1970s, and we're still using that same basic architecture. And when you have that kind of cost, you have to maintain high-level aggregated balances for the enterprise view. There's no other way. When 1 gigabyte of storage here costs you $7 million, there's no way to deploy the compute capacity against the problem unless you highly aggregate. So we're working against a trend that is very old and very long, and it's embedded in all of our business systems, every place in it. Examining Luca Pacioli's Principles of Arithmetic in 1494 in the British Library a year and a half ago, and doing a whole series of videos about that. Our systems today, the way accounting works, it has not changed since 1494. So this is ledger innovation here. And maybe we've got just a little bit of change that has happened in the last 50 years, but by and large, our systems for ledgers, the way ledgers work, has not changed in 500. And with the high school students, I took them through, I said, let's talk about the change in your parents' life from technology around communication. Can you give me examples of the change in your parents' texting, video chats, just everything? They could just go on and on and on. And I said, okay, let's talk about ledgers. Some of your parents' life. If you go back 40 years, everybody used to maintain a personal ledger of some kind. It was written in your check register, right? And the bank had the physical had another ledger, but the only time you knew what your position was, because you didn't have an internet connection, is when you went to the bank, or once a month you get a statement. So I talked to the kids about errors that creep into that sort of system. What don't you know? And they got them all, right? Oh, you transpose something, you're off by, you write $30 and it's $300, and you lose a check. You don't write down the check in. If you're not keeping this, you have no idea where you're at. So the change we're seeing in the world over the last few years, that there are a few bumps in that graphic I showed, is that, then Quicken, right? It was something that a lot of people used for maintaining, instead of doing it paper-based, they started doing Quicken. And you had automatic download. So a year ago, this month, Carrie and I decided we needed to change the way we've done personal finances. Carrie has done Quicken since 1992. I recently we decided to go away from Quicken in the course of about 10 minutes a year ago. I followed one of my daughter's leads, and we signed up for Mint, mint.com, okay? You log into Mint. In Mint, you say, I have a bank account at this location. You give them a URL. Here's the username. Here's the password. Within 10 minutes, I had loaded the 5 different accounts where I had financial data stored. And within another 5 or 10 minutes, I had a consistent view of all of my data, my ledger. Okay, but what's the change that happened there? What's the technology change that happened when I did that in 15 minutes? What did I do? I did away with a personal ledger. I no longer have a personal ledger. The thing that Mint.com added The one piece of data that is not stored in any one of those company ledgers is a category. Category is your chart of account. That is the only thing that Mint.com saves for me personally. That's the only part of this whole system that's a personal ledger, is that one field called category. And it guesses at that, and it gets it right 80, 90% of the time, but that's the only piece of data that Mint.com owns that isn't in all of these other systems. But let's go back to business for a moment. You're right, Devin. You're seeing where this goes, right? This is percentage of companies, percent ERP vendor market shares. Right? You got SAP, you got Oracle.
This is a big loop. Yeah.
Huh? This down here?
Yeah.
It's called other.
They have
But my point is that from a business perspective, the chances of doing away with your personal ledger is very difficult, right? You don't have the same opportunity right now, and there's a lot of reasons for that. One is going to be complexity control. Another reason is going to be concentration of risk on where are my ledgers and having my own, I lose my internet connection or the bank cuts me off and all of a sudden I've lost all that history. Another one's going to be regulatory. The IRS shows up and they want to see my ledgers. I talked about blockchain, the next generation, and I said, listen, if we do a simple transaction, a vendor transaction, and you think about all of the work that goes on around recording that, when a customer wants to order something, they cut a purchase order. And they send that, maybe they use EDI, right? But if they don't, they send a paper version. This vendor's got to enter it into his ERP system. Then this ERP vendor ships the goods, and they've got to get the goods. Well, they also will ship a bill of lading, and the bill of lading's got to get entered as a receipt of goods on this side in the ERP system. This company then cuts a check, sends it to here, they deposit the check, So now we've got, we're now up to 8 transactions. Then this one provides a customer statement. We've got a customer statement here. We have to do reconciling of the bank accounts and reconciling to the vendor. If you could share the ledger, those 10 plus transactions would become 3 things. You'd have a 60% reduction in transaction costs. So to kind of net it down, Al, to your point, my 10-year journey has helped me to conclude that the CFO is never going to have the budget to transform the basic way our business systems function today. It's too costly, and no one will undertake that. What you have to have is a cost savings that comes somewhere for doing it. Well, if the whole blockchain then craze, which is crazy, and I can talk to you more about why blockchain will never scale and the errors they've made in designing that. But if you could share a ledger, not use blockchain, but actually share a ledger, you can start to fund out of a 60% reduction in transaction cost, you can start to fund a lot of transformation of how systems work. But my idea was, listen, if you were to start from scratch today and you want to set up a shared ledger, well, let's just think about what I did with Mint, right? Okay, so what I do is you go to a web page and you create a user ID. That's not too hard to imagine doing, right? The next thing you have to do, though, is you have to define, if I'm going to do a business system, I have to start thinking about fields. See, this is where blockchain starts to break down. Blockchain is a blank sheet of paper. And like Rick says, the costly part of financial systems implementation is not getting a sheet of paper, it's deciding what to write on the sheet of paper. That's the costly part. What are the things you have to have a ledger? Well, one thing you got to have is you got to have security. We can talk more about that. You got to know, but you've got to have definition. A ledger has definition of fields and values. Because if you want to do something, you've got to define what are the fields and values. So you start defining what your fields and what the values are for those fields. This isn't too hard to figure out, but the next step then is to start to define a record structure, which is a ledger. I put those fields on record structures and I make my own ledger. Hey, this is the ledger. The next piece of this, though, is that I start to search for people to involve, want to share my ledger with me. And I invite them to say, hey, you want to be part of, you want to share my ledger, and we'll do transactions, and we're going to record our transactions in this ledger, right? Then we have to agree, okay, which fields out of those that I defined are ones that we're going to share? Because like my category is not something I want to share, right? But we'll share date, we'll share party, we'll share amounts, you can share currencies, all of those things, you can decide what to share. The other piece that blockchain completely misses is it has no idea of a posting process. Posting process creates balances. The only reason we create balances is because it makes compute efficiencies. Machines can get tuned. When you make a balance, you can tune how much compute capacity you use. No, I could share my balance because like on, let's say, sharing with the ledger. On my shared transactions between my vendor and my customer, I may choose to share the balance of the outstanding purchase order. I may choose to share the balance of the payments I've received netted against the charges I've received. I might share the balances themselves because it gets me to a more efficient business process. Okay, you get all of that as a very simple. Now, it's a little bit simplistic at this point, and I've had some thoughts about how do we make that a little bit more, because the system is not going to start with somebody doing that. For a business system, that's going to take too long. We have too many ledgers out there in the world. To get this system started, it has to start something much more like Mint. My point is, let's talk about security for a moment, because you went there, okay? Blockchain came out of Bitcoin, and Bitcoin was defined as a trustless world. So it meant that, I don't know this guy in the orange shirt here, but when I pull out, $5 and I give it to him, we don't have to know anything about each other, and I just transfer value to him. If I try to use this to pay this guy, he's got to know who I am, where my accounts are, what my numbers are. I've got to know him to trust him. So they define that. The fundamental problem Bitcoin made in defining that is that even when I give this guy $5, we don't trust each other, but we both trust the person that issued this. We trust that this person that printed this isn't going to change its format tomorrow. And they're not going to go print so many more of them that it becomes worthless to him the day after tomorrow. Trust is what makes banking work. It's what makes financial transactions work. There's no trustlessness in financial systems. It's a fundamental flaw at the bottom of Bitcoin, at the bottom of blockchain. Luca Pacioli is documented by the guy that wrote Measure for Measure. He said Luca Pacioli made nations and enterprises stand still for a moment and be measured. Because our analysis of what's happened, we only do periodically. It's when we issue financial. It's why we do ledgers. It's because we only measure periodically. You got to stand back and say, what's happened over the last month? Did I make money? Did I spend money? Am I going up? Am I going down? That measurement is going to be a periodic thing. It's not going to happen every transaction. Our brains don't work that way. We analyze things periodically, and it's independent from how often the transactions have happened. And that analysis is going to continue that way forever because it's the way our brains work. This security model for a true shared ledger is going to use many more types of security and be much more nuanced for simple things like access. So let's say all of us have our own individual ledgers and we're set up in a business of some kind. My partitioning of my shared ledger will be, I have partitions with every person that I do transactions with, and I do access control. You and I are the only two that have access to that partition. The rest of you guys, sorry, you don't get to see it. Now, if we have five-way party transactions, then we make a partition that the five of us have access to, but nobody else gets access to. Okay, so that's kind of what this comes down to, right? Is these are steps that might go on. The first thing that you've got to set up is you've got to set up the public user information. I've got to have a definition of my ledger that I'm sharing between two parties. Now that becomes something that everybody in the world doesn't have access to. The two of us have to have access to that shared configuration. So we have to have that shared in some way, and the code that goes along with that, right? In blockchain, the chain code is we implement chain code, so we each get to verify a transaction before it gets stored. We each get to see it. That sort of thing is all part of this. When I get down, I've got to have a dynamic reference data environment. The reference data environment is going to have some portion of it shared for those things that are references of data fields that we share, but there's going to be another portion of the reference data environment that's not shared. My chart of account, my category in Mint, I don't have to share that with anybody. And when you actually get to the physical partitions themselves, you're going to start to get choices of whether you have this sitting all on a universal ledger, and you don't use a physical partitioning of machines to get access to it. You start to make a partition of machine that is for that shared ledger, and we're only two that have access to that cloud environment. It's partitioned in such a way that I'm locking people out of actually the physical environment in some way. And I go clear over to each one of us having our own servers. And I replicate. If I go to this far, then I'm stepping away from the most cost-effective, because now I'm replicating ledger data. But I may choose to do that for security purposes, for backup purposes, for longevity of the environment. I may choose to go to a replicated data environment to share, because I'll use less expensive forms of rock-solid security. Security is primary. Let me make that statement, right? The first point in my definition of what you need for a ledger is the first point is security, because you're not going to go write things down that can't be shared. But today's world, I have so many options available to me for getting to rock-solid security that doesn't involve encryption that anybody on the internet can look at. I'm going to open up all of those kinds of options so I can tune security to the appropriate cost, so that my 60% savings in transaction volume isn't taken up by 120% growth in compute cost, because the security model is so out of whack. When IBM defined Hyperledger, they were smart in that they said, listen, this blockchain thing is crazy. What's going to happen is we're going to define Hyperledger, which is going to define communities of people that will work in this thing. But the dumb thing they did was they picked up that file format that was for a trustless environment, and they stuck it at the middle of this thing that they already could recognize we need a better security model. Well, the file format in there is stupid. Good. So how will this system start? Because it's probably not going to start. It's a network problem, right? And network problems don't start with the network in place. They have to grow the network, right? So I'm positing that the universal shared ledger would start as a reporting system. It's going to start as a mashup of existing ledgers. I can't go to the CFOs today and say, you should do this, and we're going to rewrite all of your systems. But you could go to the CFO and say, if you start down this journey, you're going to get to 60% reduction, but you're not going to start to get 60% cost savings up front. What we're going to do up front is we're going to start to establish a reporting environment that gets you greater consistency across your ledgers, across your counterparties. So it starts as a reporting system. The next thing is that it starts to allow for entry of new transactions into the system. So the first thing is only extract. The next step is that you start to allow original entry, even if it's just adjustments. Then, once you've started to do that, you've started to make a transactional ledger, because you now have the ability to put originating business events into that ledger. Now you start to collect people, and it only has to be you and one other counterparty that agrees to share the ledger. You only have to start one at a time, and you're just making a partition for that counterparty, and so the system grows by counterparty coming onto the system. And that's how the system would end up growing over time, is that people would start to adopt it. In the end, it could become the point about not trusting cash. You could start to do settlement in the system that you actually then just use credits inside the system as your form of payment. And it actually could get to a virtual currency at some point, but that's way down the road. Here's what I've tried to code. That you have the metadata, ledger definition, take that simplistic. You've got the ledger file input, you've got the import process, or you've got, actually an idea here, is that there are open ERP systems in the world. They're not very widely used. There's an interesting one, though, called OFBiz, Apache. This is an open source ERP system. Has a full set of screens. You can get to the data model for it. My idea was that it would be nice to go prototype and see if I could define a semantic layer. Basically, instead of talking directly to the database, I would create a set of views, and the OFBiz code would talk to those views, but I would reorganize the database in the background behind a universal ledger. Because part of the problem also in the world that I'm talking about, if you really want to solve the analytical problem, the disparity of all the ledgers for every business process is a problem. Because everybody, at the end of the day, they want to see purchases against receipts, against shipments, against sales. And all that ends up doing is we've got to go build a data warehouse to bring these different data structures together. Well, in fact, you did a universal ledger, which we did, then you could store that data in a consistent structure across every business process. And I do away with the whole integration environment for the data warehouse, because I have this data in a consistent structure right up front. If you're going to start down this road of transformation, if you're going to use that 60% savings, then go solve that problem as well, because you'll get savings out of that you're spending today that I don't even have to put in the business case by all of your integration work that goes on at the back. So then the next phase of the process is ID assignment, because you got to have, unless the IDs are entered from the front end screens, if the data is coming from someplace else, I've got to have consistent IDs. We do that today. You've got to do accounting rules, because you've got to get to debit credit representations on things. So there's internal representation, external representation. I've got to have a potential posting process, right? But this is all about doing the financial processes like multi-currency, reclass, all of those things. And I've got an analysis phase. That's what the basic phase is. But you all know that, because that's the system we built. Well, let me give a little bit of a positive spin, though. My mind has changed in the last 2 months. I feel confident that I'm over the issues of definition of what the problem is. You've seen a lot of detail today that's come in the last 4 months about, hey, here's the parameters of the problem. Just getting, I do feel very comfortable on that 60% cost savings. I mean, that's a huge number to be able to stand up in front of somebody and say, yeah, if we share this data with your counterparties, you're going to have a significant cost saving. So we aren't yet at the point of marketing, because I'm just finishing, in a certain sense, the definition of what the problem is. But that is the problem that stands out next.